Right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the March Liverpool Dementia and Aging Research Forum. Today we have a lovely presenter, Danielle Wyman. She's a final year PhD student, and she will be talking about how can we improve well-being and quality of life for people with dementia and their carers. And she'll be sharing some insights from a process evaluation. Okay, just again, making people aware to please mute themselves. Thank you. So throughout, we'll have Danielle's talk, and throughout you can pose your questions in the chat function as always. And then after about 30-35 minutes of Danielle's talk, we'll be picking up the questions, your comment, and we'll talk through them. If simultaneously you'd like to join us on social media, please feel free to use the hashtag Liverpool Dementia as well, and we'll be chatting on there as well. So Danielle, I can't see you right now. You've got lost on the screen. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
There you are. So welcome, Danielle. Lovely to have you, and over to you. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm Danielle Wyman, and thank you for joining me today. I'm going to talk about insights from process evaluations and how we can use these to help improve well-being, quality of life for people living with dementia and their carers. Just to check everyone can see that okay.
Perfect.
So today I'm going to talk to you about introduce the NIDUS-Family Intervention and talk through what that is, introduce you to process evaluations, look at insights from process evaluations, and then look at what does this all mean. So a couple of terms I'll be using throughout this talk I thought good to just kind of highlight at this point. I'll be talking about randomized controlled trials, which are studies in which people from a population that's similar kind of group of people are randomly assigned to two or more groups, and these are used to test drugs, treatments or interventions. So today I'll be talking about psychosocial interventions, which are interventions that look at improving well-being and quality of life for a population, and they involve both kind of psychological and social aspects. So this slide looks quite busy, I apologise, but I thought it was quite good to fit all the pieces of this talk together, all the pieces of the puzzle and how they kind of fit. So I will talk about all these in more detail on the following slides, but really to see how all this comes together and why I'm talking about these things today. So we've got the NIDUS-Family Randomised Control Trial, which I'll talk more about in a moment, but it's an Alzheimer's Society funded psychosocial intervention to support people living with dementia to achieve their goals that they and their family set towards living as independently and as well as possible at home for longer. And running alongside that is the process evaluation, which I'm running for my PhD at Anglia Ruskin University. And I'm looking to see how, so this process evaluation will look at how NIDUS family influences change as measured by their kind of goal attainment. So I'll go through all of that later. And then both of these things will, outputs from both of the trial and the process evaluation will look to inform kind of implementation of this intervention into practice. So that's how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. So NIDUS family, it stands for the New Interventions for Independence in Dementia Study. And it's the family stream. There's also a professional stream, but we're not going to touch on that today. And it's an Alzheimer's Society funded psychosocial intervention. It's looking to support people living with dementia and their family carers live independently at home for as long and as well as possible. And it does this through setting and working towards goals based around the person living with dementia and their carers' needs. And this work is carried out within the Alzheimer's Society Centre for Excellence at UCL. It's also carried out with the Queen Mary University of London, and I'm running the process evaluation from Anglia Ruskin University as a kind of slightly independent evaluation. So looking at the timelines of NIDUS, so it started in March 2020, and if many of you can remember March 2020, we kind of all were heading into lockdown. So this trial was meant to be delivered face-to-face, but very quickly changed to being delivered remotely so it could continue within the timelines it was originally set to and still be delivered through that period of lockdown. So instead of face-to-face, it was all delivered kind of remotely, virtually. It was delivered to dyads, which include people living with dementia and their family carers. And 204 dyads were randomised to the intervention arm, so they received the NIDUS intervention, and 98 have been randomised to the control group. So there's no longer recruiting, recruitment's finished, and the final people are kind of coming off the trial now. So this slide looks at the theoretical kind of principles in which we hope NIDUS intervention works. And the reason I'm sharing this with you will become a bit more evident when I talk about process evaluations, but it's really important when running process evaluations to understand the theory on which an intervention is built. So the NIDUS family was built on these kind of principles. So looking at the values and approaches, so it aimed to be person-centered, carer-focused, relationship-focused and compassionate, balance rights to autonomy and protection, value connections with previous roles and networks, modify the environment at home and the wider environment to be dementia-friendly, and tailor activity to the individuals. And this, the strategies in which NIDUS family aims to kind of implement those values and approaches are through identifying and prioritising needs and goals of people with dementia and their carers, and use psychological and occupational therapy strategies, which we'll go through in a bit more detail later, and enable self-management. And this is all to be delivered through a single point of contact, so through ideally one facilitator to deliver consistent and joined up care. So those are kind of the underpinnings of how NIDUS family is built. And the aim is to be kind of a multi-component intervention based on these theoretical principles of values and approaches, strategies and delivery model that can support people living with dementia to live with a quality of life in their own homes for longer. So it's a very complex, what we call kind of multimodal intervention. There's lots of components. So I've kind of tried to simplify it down to these 9 boxes to show you the flow of somebody going through what somebody going through the trial would experience. So a dyad going through this would have the pre-assessment measures to start with. So these are all based around kind of factors of wellbeing and quality of life. Then they'd have their first session with the facilitator where they discuss the needs and preferences of that specific dyad for staying independent at home. So you're looking there to start implementing those strategies. Then from that, kind of directly from those needs and preferences, goals will be set. And these goals, they'll have 3 to 5 goals per dyad. And these kind of are the core of NIDUS. So these are really important in terms of, as we'll see later, one of the kind of primary measures is goal attainment scaling to see how people have attained their goals over the 12 months of NIDUS. So these kind of the crux of what people are trying to achieve over these 12 months. So following setting these goals, facilitators will map them to modules, which I'll go through in a bit more detail. They'll also look at kind of the dyad support network and other local resources and services that the dyad can use. And then they'll attend these 6 to 8 sessions, which will take over about 6 months, where they'll work through the modules, and at the end of those, they'll set an action plan in which they'll go off after these 6 months to kind of work towards actioning those goals, towards achieving those goals. At this point, you get 6-month assessment measures. And then after that, so dyads will be kind of carrying out those action plans. They will have check-in calls with facilitators to offer support and any troubleshooting. And then finally, we get to the 12-month assessment measures, which are kind of the primary measures for the NIDUS trial to see if it's been effective. And these are done through goal attainment scaling, which I'll go through in more detail. And following that, they have 18-month and 24-month post-assessment measures, and that's going to look at kind of more the longer term impact. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how NIDUS family works. So looking at those goals that people are setting, they have to be kind of specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound to make sure that we can measure them accurately at that 12-month goal attainment scaling. And how they're measured is when they set the goals, they'll set scores of 0, what 0 is, which is how that goal stands now, so a baseline measure. Then you have a +1 and a +2, which look at kind of meaningfully better, and then +2 is the most kind of the best possible outcome within realistic outcome within the time period. And then the other way, you've got the -1 and -2, so looking at meaningfully worse than baseline, and then -2 is the worst outcome that's realistic over a year. So that's what's measured at kind of the 12-month. And when setting the goals for NIDUS-Family, they're set across these kind of domains and goal areas. I won't go into all of these in detail, but you can see there's kind of based around behaviour, cognition, mood, independent activities of daily living. So all the goals are kind of around these core areas. So the modules, so each dyad will go through 2 to 4 modules, and it will take 1 to 3 sessions per module. So that's kind of what they work at in those 6 to 8 sessions with the facilitators, working through these, which are mapped to their goals. And each module is based on these psychosocial and occupational kind of therapy strategies. So they're underpinned by things such as psychoeducation, behavioural activation, communication skills. So the core modules that NIDUS use are around accepting care, arranging and planning for the future, communication, managing behaviours, managing physical health conditions, exercise, activity and mobility, managing mood, anxiety, apathy, carer wellbeing and support, looking at safety and managing that home kind of environment, relaxation and stress management strategies, and sleep, diet and healthy routines. So those are the core kind of strategies in which people can work through their goals and plan those and come out with the action plan of how to attain them. So I've spoke a little bit about that primary kind of measure of the goal attainment scaling. So looking at the primary goal of NIDUS-Family, it's looking to evaluate the effect of NIDUS-Family and usual care on goal attainment. So do the dyads attain their goals over a 12-month period using the values and approaches, strategies and delivery method of NIDUS-Family? So that's what they're kind of looking at the effectiveness. And then there's some secondary objectives which look at those well-being and quality of life measures around kind of functional independence, quality of life, services, use and care costs, duration living at home. So all of those help to see if NIDUS-Family is going to be effective. And when going through NIDUS-Family, I suppose this slide kind of shows ideal or examples of what somebody might have at the end of NIDUS. So looking at those kind of goal domains that they set, what are the intended goal outcomes that NIDUS would like to be seen through somebody going through NIDUS? So overall, it's looking for someone to feel supported, so that the dyad can live in, so the person with dementia and the family carer can live independently at home for as long and as well as possible. In terms of the dyad themselves, looking at kind of improved communication, improved relationship, improved shared, positive shared activities. Looking at person living with dementia, you're looking at decreased kind of neuropsychiatric symptoms, so things like apathy, aggression, depression, looking at increased daily activities, increasing involvement in meaningful activities, increasing kind of social networks and links back to community, improving that home environment to be more dementia friendly and healthier daily routines. And then outcomes, desired outcomes for the carers are things like increasing their understanding of mood and behaviours, increasing communication for working, liaising with care providers or services and networks, greater understanding of needs and preferences for the person they're caring for, change in carer emotional responses to care stresses, increase their carer self-care, and opportunities to reflect on risks and make plans to manage them. So that's kind of NIDUS-Family in a nutshell and what they're aiming to do and how they're going to do it. So now I'm going to move on to process evaluations. And before I speak specifically about the NIDUS-Family process evaluation, I'm just going to introduce them as a whole. So these are the how of randomized controlled trials. Excuse me, sorry. So these look at, if we think about a randomized controlled trial, we're thinking about, these tell us if an intervention works. So they look at measuring effectiveness of complex psychosocial interventions. When we look at process evaluations, these are telling us how those complex interventions influence change. And these process evaluations are run alongside randomized controlled trials. So why would we use process evaluation? Well, they help us to understand how an evaluation works. They help us to understand how interventions generate outcomes. So they investigate things like how, why, for whom, in what context, and under what circumstances interventions work or don't work. They provide detailed understanding of the interventions. So as the process evaluation uses the theoretical principles of the intervention they're designed around those to test them. So they test those cause assumptions kind of drawn from intervention theory. So assumptions on which the intervention is based to cause effect. So if the intervention does this, we would assume that this would happen. And the process evaluation tests that kind of process. They help determine if an intervention works, if it doesn't work, and also any unanticipated consequences, or how it can be optimized. And they can be really powerful in terms of outputs from process evaluations can help inform policy and implementation of interventions into practice. So process evaluations can really help refine theory and advance our knowledge. They can contribute to better designed interventions for that population in the future. And they can inform how that intervention can be implemented in practice to make sure the parts of that intervention that really influence change through the trial can be maximised when being delivered in kind of real life setting. So this slide is looking at how do we find out all of those things? How does process evaluation kind of find all those things? So I'm using the Medical Research Council guidance process evaluations, which is one of the core frameworks for process evaluations. There are many others, but this is kind of one of the main ones. And they look at three key functions. So contextual factors. So by that, we mean anything external to the intervention that influences the intervention's implementation or its effects. Now, this can be things like participants' beliefs, or facilitators' beliefs. It can also be things like time constraints. So a participant might struggle to do the intervention activities they need to, and this could influence their the impact on them in kind of going through that intervention. Looking at implementation factors. So these are the structures and the resources and processes through which delivery of the intervention is achieved. Also looking at kind of quantity, quality of what is delivered. So these looks at things like dose, so how much of whatever the intervention is doing is delivered to the recipients, and reach, how much of that population does this intervention reach? And finally, we've got mechanisms of impact. So this looks at participant responses to and interactions with the intervention. It looks at how the participants' interactions with the intervention's activities triggers change. So looking at kind of designing a process evaluation, there's a couple of things that are kind of advised for best practice. And these are using a framework such as the MRC guidance, using a theory-based approach. So looking at the theory of the intervention to inform your process evaluation. The aims are looking at those kind of three key functions of implementation, mechanisms of impact, and contextual factors, and using mixed method design. So integrate, and most importantly, integrating qualitative and quantitative data. So they build on each other so you can really understand what mechanisms are going on to influence change. And the ticks here show that moving on to the NIDUS process evaluation, we have used that best practice to inform our process evaluation. So I'm actually running the process evaluation for my PhD. So in this, I have used the MRC guidance to inform the design of the process evaluation, looking to understand the mechanisms of impact, implementation and contextual factors, and also identify which of these factors are essential for influencing effectiveness of the NIDUS-Family intervention, applying mixed methods, and the outputs from the process evaluation will lead to kind of theory development, intervention refinement, and inform implementation of NIDUS into practice. So, process evaluation is quite complex in its own right. This is kind of a simplified version of kind of workflow of how process evaluation takes place. So you've got, initially, I kind of looked at the current research and current literature to understand how process evaluations work within the population I'm looking at. Then looking at kind of collecting that qualitative and quantitative data and analysing that and integrating that to create the outputs so we can see what parts of that actually influence change for this population. So today, to look at the insights of process evaluations, I'm going to deep dive into kind of the systematic review I did, but I just wanted to put that in kind of the timeline, that this is the part we're going to look at now. So I wanted to understand how process evaluations for psychosocial interventions, particularly designed to improve well-being and quality of life for people with dementia living at home and their carers, kind of were looking. So I wanted to review these so I could start to understand common themes or look at what are the mechanisms through those process evaluations for looking at those psychological interventions for well-being and quality of life for this particular population, and start to understand what's going on there, how change is being influenced. So I reviewed 24 process evaluations, fitted that criteria of looking at psychosocial interventions for well-being and quality of life for people living with dementia at home and their carers. And I reviewed those. I looked at framework design and approach that they applied. I looked at the process evaluation aims, because process evaluations can look at various different components. So I also looked at the components they evaluated and their key findings. And just to mention at this point, what's really powerful is by reviewing process evaluations, so this reviewed 24 process evaluations, these evaluated, it was 22 psychosocial interventions. 2 of the process evaluations looked at the same intervention, just different kind of factors. But now we can start to really look at the key findings of implementation, contextual factors and mechanisms of impact across these huge complex psychosocial interventions, which look at so many different mechanisms, strategies, values, and we can start to look at common themes across these and really identify what are the core things for this that's influencing change for this population. That starts to become quite powerful in terms of being able to generalize results. So key findings, just looking, I mentioned that I looked at frameworks, and so 14 used a framework out of 24. Only 5 actually used theory to inform their designs, and there was a range of methods that people used to carry out their process evaluations. In terms of the aims of the process evaluations, it was really important to understand what they were looking at, what they were aiming to kind of evaluate out of that intervention, and then the components they evaluated to measure those aims. So in terms of implementation factors, these process evaluations looked at factors of adherence, feasibility, participant engagement, looking at mechanisms of impact, it's kind of participant responses to the intervention. And in terms of context, 4 process evaluations ran a particular method kind of framework, which looked particularly at contextual factors. The others kind of didn't look at that in terms of their design. So, kind of meat of why we're here today, I suppose you could say, is the findings from this of how we can look at these kind of common themes across these 24 process evaluations, looking at 22 psychosocial interventions, we can start to find common themes that influence outcomes, influence change for this population. So in terms of contextual factors, it was found that the common kind of components that influenced outcomes were: if carers felt too burdened to support the intervention, then the interventions were less effective. The participants' need for the intervention and stage of dementia were really key to the intervention success. So making sure that the intervention is kind of meets participants at the right time in their journey for it to be successful. And adherence to exercise interventions was better if participants were motivated and aware of potential benefits. So those were kind of the external things that we found to really influence the effectiveness of interventions. Implementation factors, it was looking at where the interventions specifically targeted family carers. There needed to be this kind of flexibility and support within the intervention. The content needed to be adaptable, and those intervention components need to be easy to deliver, also flexibly delivered. So in terms of when participants could carry out those activities, needs to be quite a flexible model. And also the ease of the activities that the participant was doing. So whether it was physical activity or they had kind of counselling sessions or whatever it was that the intervention was doing, they needed to be kind of easy to carry out. And finally, we've got the mechanisms of impact. So the kind of mechanisms, common mechanisms of impact that influence outcomes were the importance of providing an element of support for the family carer. It was found that where high engagement and enjoyment, so where participants really engaged and enjoyed the intervention activities, then that really facilitated quite positive change. And routine was also something that was found to be important across those psychosocial interventions, both in terms of how the intervention was delivered, but also how participants could factor those activities and build a routine of those into their kind of day-to-day lives. That really impacted kind of change. So in terms of now we can look at those common themes, we can start to generalize and make those applicable. We can look at how can we use these to build interventions for this population that can really help influence well-being and quality of life for people living with dementia at home and their carers. And these kind of 4 core elements are things that would be recommended for future interventions to kind of embed. So creating an intervention that's easy to deliver, engaging, enjoyable, easy to carry out activities and can build into a routine. Ensuring the intervention can be adapted and tailored to the participants, that the intervention offers an element of support to the family carer, and also ensuring that the delivery is appropriate within timeline, prognosis of dementia and need. So those are core factors on which we can recommend kind of future interventions to adapt those into their into the design when building interventions for this population. So what does this all mean? So looking across this, quite a lot of information here about different aspects, but overall we can see that process evaluations can really help us understand how interventions can influence change across a population. So by reviewing these process evaluations that look at related complex interventions, we can help identify common themes across a population, making them more generalizable. And knowing the key mechanisms, implementation, contextual factors across several interventions for the same population can really help us to build more targeted interventions. And in this instance, we can understand and help implement the factors that can help influence change for people living with dementia and their family carers to ensure targeted interventions help improve well-being and quality of life. So I'd like to open up to any questions.
That was great. Thank you so much, Danielle. A very different slant compared to the usual topics that we have here, because it's more about taking a kind of meta step on it, isn't it? It's not, you don't necessarily look at the direct things. So we look at whether living in a certain neighborhood is linked to you accessing care, but you're looking at the kind of meta level of it for interventions, which is so important though, because we need to understand what works in what context, for whom, under what circumstances.
And that's exactly what process evaluations do. I think you summarised them perfectly there.
I try. So I understand it's a little bit different, but I think it's really important. That was really lovely presentation. Thank you so much, Danielle. And we do so much intervention work in research, but now it's open to the audience. Are there any questions that you have? Please post them in the chat. We've got some questions here, but feel free to comment throughout. So Danielle, do facilitators have a manual or workbook which talks about how to deliver each module?
Yes, so NIDUS-Family is a manualised intervention. Probably should mention that. So all facilitators are fully trained to deliver, and they have kind of a manual in which to work from. However, there is flexibility in this, because I think the main thing about NIDUS intervention is that it's flexible to the needs of the participants, of those dyads kind of moving through it. So does that answer the question as such? So there is a manual, there is kind of a guide for facilitators to follow, so that each person can have kind of a similar feel. And the manual and the facilitators are really important in embedding those kind of values and approaches. So being person, centered, kind of carer focused. So that's all built into that kind of how it's delivered through the facilitator. So that's quite an important part.
And I suppose having a manual, having that clear structure for what effectively is research now, can then help to implement that and roll it out if and when it's found to be effective. So it doesn't have to be research anymore, but it's actually hopefully rolled out on a wider scale, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. The hope is that this will be kind of implemented into into wider practice.
Mm-hmm. So what about people who are living alone, people with dementia who don't have a carer?
So many people who went through this intervention were living on their own, living independently at home. They would probably go through this with a family member or a friend or somebody that could support them through this journey. So they would work together with somebody else to go through the intervention. So they go through it together.
Okay, so it's not exclusive to people who live together with a person.
No, not at all. No. So it's all about the person with dementia being able to live independently at home for longer. And I suppose doing it with a family carer or an informal carer helps just embed what's needed. So actually a lot of people lived independently at home, so they might have done it with their son or daughter who lives somewhere else, but they just kind of go through the intervention, but things are put in place for the person with dementia at their home. Yeah.
And going back to the manual, I'm just picking up on some of the questions Alison is asking. As an OT, she's interested to know whether OTs were involved in the manual and in the intervention design.
I assume they were. They were based upon occupational therapy, and I think we've got some of the NIDUS team in here who might be able to answer this a bit more appropriately. But I feel that when setting the modules, hi Jessica, I can see you coming up there. Do you want to take this one, or? So
I can. Hi, sorry, I'm Jessica, so I'm the NIDUS-Family Program Manager. We had 2 OTs in the co-production groups that were put together right at the beginning of the study to co-produce the intervention modules. So yeah, they were very helpful. They're from Camden and Islington, if I remember correctly.
Great, thank you.
Thanks,
Moving on from the manual and co-production, are there any interim results that you can make us aware of, Danielle and Jessica?
In terms of the NIDUS family trial, not at this point, because we're still collecting data. So we haven't, the analysis hasn't been done yet. So it's still all blinded and under, nothing, sorry. So yeah, we haven't got anything at this moment in time in terms of the trial. So unfortunately, can't share anything.
Ah, that's fine. So another question from Abby here. What types of activities did people partake in?
So in terms of activities, so I suppose the intervention was around them setting goals, and those goals could be things like having more meaningful activities in their day-to-day. So then they would go through the modules, and then if that was kind of one of their goals, they might say things like, well, I can go and have coffee with a friend once a week, or I can go for a walk with, you know, go for a walk once a day. So it was up to them to kind of form what was appropriate for them and what it meant to them. So what a meaningful activity meant to that individual as opposed to a generic meaning. So it was very tailored in that respect. But and then obviously they could then work towards that. Yeah,
I suppose that increases the interest in it as well, isn't it? Not everyone wants to go to a group setting, for example, but people want to do specific things, very personalized care approaches.
Exactly, and I think that was the main thing about this, is it was personalized to the individual and how they could attain the goal that was a goal set by them for them. Mm-hmm. So it was meaningful to them as an individual.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question from a fellow PhD student here from Liverpool as well. So thanks for a great presentation, Danielle. She's interested in your plans for the data collection analysis phase of your PhD.
Yes, so I am in that phase at the moment. So I'm trying to think, it's quite complicated. It might be something I can, I'm happy to meet up offline and go through my process, like how I've gone about it. But really kind of on top level, the qualitative data, I've interviewed participants at the 12 months. So dyads that have finished the NIDUS-Family at 12 months. I've run an interview, I've interviewed those to talk about lots of things, just about how they've kind of experienced receiving the intervention, how they found working towards their goals. So that's been really interesting in terms of looking at participants' responses, what they found to be the important parts. And that's going to form quite a large proportion of my kind of output. And then the quantitative, and I've also interviewed the facilitators that delivered it to see how they found delivering it, and kind of more information from them. And then the quantitative part, I've looked at observation kind of data. So on the sessions which were run by NIDUS, they usually kind of recorded a session. So I've looked at those, one of those sessions, for example, and I've got criteria against that, which are looking for those values and approaches, strategies and delivery. Can we see them throughout that session? Are they being implemented? And kind of what impact that's having across a number of sessions. And then people giving kind of feedback on the intervention, you know, a rating scale of how they found it at the end. And there'll be some descriptive statistics when we get the final analysis from the trial. So there's lots and lots of data, but I'd be happy to, if you wanted more detail, to go through that all offline.
And that answers another question from Shannon as well. What are the next steps for you? So a lot of data analysis, isn't it?
Yes, I'm kind of nearing more the end of it now, but that's been the part I've been in, which has been so interesting to actually kind of place the voices of people living with dementia and their carers going through the trial and find out what's really important to them. That's been really powerful for me. So there's going to be a lot of insights. Unfortunately, can't share any quite this moment, but hopefully I can come back at another point and share those when we've got them.
Definitely, definitely. Unless there are any other questions, thank you so much, Danielle. That was fantastic. Different angle as well to usual. So really great to hear from you. If you don't mind, could you click the next slide? Just so, yes, super. So again, thanks, Danielle. For the next webinar that will be held on the 10th of May, I've just sent the Eventbrite link in the chat with you as well. So we will hear from Wendy Widener, who is working for Alzheimer's Disease International, and they do fabulous and really chunky and important reports annually on world Alzheimer's issues, global issues surrounding Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and other dementia subtypes. So last year's one, as you see here, was life after diagnosis and the lack of support that people receive once they have a diagnosis. So she will be sharing the work from the reports and the work that she does at ADI, and hopefully we'll see you there. So thank you, Danielle, and I'm going to give a hand, what's the word? Here we go, a clap. So if everyone wants to give a clap to Danielle in the virtual, there we go. Lovely to see you all and hopefully see you in May again. Bye now.